Welcome to Knowledge Targeting Part 18, the Directed Energy Professional Society and the Military-Industrial Complex. Over the next 2 hours, we will not chase a device. We will map an institution, a real nonprofit with a journal, an annual symposium, a headquarters address in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and a membership drawn from government program offices and the contractors who build the hardware. Everything named here has a public record. We begin with what that record actually says. That sentence sets the terms. This episode's subject is not hidden. The Directed Energy Professional Society files paperwork, sells conference tickets, and publishes a peer-reviewed journal. The laboratories it serves have visitor centers and public fact sheets. What follows is an exercise in reading open records carefully and in noticing exactly where those records stop. The hard part is not finding the buildings. The hard part is refusing to claim more than the buildings prove. Knowledge Targeting is a 50-part documentary series published by TI One Voice. It works through the literature of electronic harassment and organized stalking one subject at a time, and it holds a single discipline throughout. Documented fact and contested claim are never allowed to blur. The series is built for people who want the record itself, not reassurance and not alarm. Where something is proven, we say so. Where it is testimony, we label it testimony. This is Part 18 of 50 inside Section 2, the technology of targeting. Part 17 examined the weaponization of 5G and 6G and massive MIMO antenna arrays, the physics of beamforming in civilian infrastructure. Part 19 will take up the psychotronic weapon, its definition, its history, and its legal status. Between those two sits this one, which asks a different question. Not what the machine could do, but who owns it, funds it, and staffs it. TI One Voice is the platform this series comes from. It hosts an evidence library where targets document incidents in a consistent, time-stamped format. A knowledge base of several thousand catalog documents, from declassified files to academic papers, and a community wall where people compare experiences without being told what to conclude. You will find all of it at one.witisk.org. Nothing on this platform diagnoses anyone. It stores, organizes, and preserves what people submit. There is also TI-TV, a 24-hour live stream that runs the series continuously, alongside interviews, archive material, and community broadcasts. You can watch it at meet.witisk.org, under Public, TI-TV. Every episode also ships with a written companion article carrying the full source list, so you can check each institution, budget line, and date against its public record rather than taking our word for it. Reading along is encouraged. Disagreeing with us in writing is better. This episode was assembled by retrieval over the TI One Voice knowledge base, thousands of documents indexed and searched by meaning rather than keyword, so that a chapter about laser research surfaces the bibliography, the Defense Science Board Task Force report, and the Human Rights Survey that mention it. Retrieval is a starting point, not an authority. Every institutional fact you hear was checked against the organization's published material or against congressional oversight documents before it entered the script. 3 registers, kept apart in every slide, demonstrated a named organization, contract, budget line, or publication, with a date, public, checkable, and described accurately. Filed patents and proposals which prove that somebody wrote something down, not that a device exists or was ever deployed. Claimed the assertion that this institutional world directs covert attacks on individuals. That 3rd register is testimony and inference. We will say so every single time it appears. One rule governs everything that follows. Organizations, agencies, contractors, and conferences may be named because they are matters of public record. Their members, officers, speakers, and employees may not be. Attending a symposium is not evidence of wrongdoing. Publishing a paper on beam propagation is not evidence of wrongdoing. We will describe incentives, budgets, and revolving doors, which is ordinary journalism, and we will not turn any of that into an accusation against a living person. A word to targets watching. This episode will show you a large, well-funded research establishment, and that can land two ways. It can feel like vindication, or it can feel like being very small. Neither reaction is a finding. The existence of a laser directorate at Kirtland tells you nothing about your own case, in either direction. What we can offer is an accurate map, and the honest boundaries of it. Take your time with it. The chapter runs in 6 movements. First, the Directed Energy Professional Society itself. Second, the High Energy Laser Joint Technology Office, the Joint Department of Defense PERS created in 2000. Third, the laboratories Kirtland, Maui, Maryland, Washington. Fourth, the 711th Human Performance Wing at Wright-Patterson. Fifth, Monterey and Huntsville, and the full institutional map. Sixth, and most important, the line between a documented machine and an undocumented accusation about where it is pointed. So we begin, as the chapter does, not with a person but with a chart. It reproduces a program progression from DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, as it appears in the source document behind this chapter. 5 phrases, in sequence. Read quickly, they are jargon. Read slowly, they describe an arc, and the arc has a stated destination. Here is what those 5 phrases actually say in order and what they do not. Behavior, biosilico interface, brain technology, enhanced human performance, enhanced system performance. From studying how people behave, through an interface between biology and silicon, through brain technology itself, to 2 declared destinations, a human being who performs better, and a system that performs better. This is institutional shorthand, not testimony, and research categories of this kind are not seriously disputed. What the chart does not show is any device, any target, or any deployment. The document anchoring this chapter is cataloged in the TI-1 Voice Knowledge Base as KB19. It lists directed energy internships funded by the High Energy Laser Joint Technology Office, names 7 host institutions, and lists the disciplines they draw on. What makes it useful is its form. It reads less like an argument and more like an inventory. Offices, cities, disciplines, the kind of material that either checks out against a public fact sheet or does not. One number gives the scale. The Air Force Research Laboratories Directed Energy Directorate reports a budget north of $300 million a year. That is a single directorate at a single base in a single service, not the whole field. It buys buildings, test ranges, optics, staff, and graduate stipends. It is also, crucially, a published figure. You can look it up. That is what makes it usable evidence rather than rumor. The Government Accountability Office and the Congressional Research Service have both reviewed parts of this program publicly, since at least 2005. That oversight trail matters twice over. It confirms these are not invented institutions, and it also shows what oversight has not found. Nothing in the public record we have reviewed establishes that this infrastructure has been aimed at a specific, unconsenting civilian. Holding that line is not evasion. It is the honest position. So to the first of the 6, what the Directed Energy Professional Society actually is. Strip away the subject matter and it looks entirely ordinary. Incorporated around the turn of the millennium, founded in 1998, by the account held in the knowledge base, headquartered in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and organized around the unglamorous business of conferences, publications, and professional recognition. Nonprofit paperwork, committee meetings, a journal, and an annual symposium with an exhibit hall. Its stated mission is to foster the research, development, and operational transition of directed energy technologies, high-energy lasers, and high-power microwave systems for national defense and civil applications. That last phrase matters. The society presents itself as bridging military and civilian uses of the same physics. Laser communications, industrial cutting, weapons. It publishes the Journal of Directed Energy and runs annual symposia, workshops, and short courses. Much of that program is classified or export-controlled, so attendance is restricted. Why does a field this close to classified work need a public society at all? Because even sensitive research communities need an unclassified space to recruit graduate students, to publish citable work that builds careers, and to let government program offices talk to industry without routing every conversation through a classification review. So the society is not a secret. It is the opposite, the visible seam where a mostly hidden field touches open professional life. And the address is itself a piece of data. Albuquerque sits less than 10 miles from Kirtland Air Force Base, home to the Air Force Research Laboratory's Directed Energy Directorate, the largest concentration of directed energy people and money in the Department of Defense. The proximity is practical, not conspiratorial. But it tells you who the society primarily serves. In the next block, we follow that membership into the buildings themselves and into the money. So what does this society actually do day to day? 3 things, and all 3 are publicly documented. It runs an annual symposium, publishes a peer-reviewed journal, and it maintains a membership roll drawn from government, industry, and the universities. None of that is hidden. Each function leaves a paper trail you can follow from outside the fence, which is precisely why the seam at Albuquerque is worth watching so closely. Start with the symposium. The Directed Energy Science and Technology Symposium runs 2 tracks in parallel. The unclassified sessions are open to outside researchers, to journalists, and to interested members of the public. The classified sessions are held separately, restricted to attendees holding security clearances, and cover whatever the open literature cannot. Both facts matter. The closed track is real. So is the open one, and the open one is checkable. Look at what fills those open sessions. Papers on laser propagation through atmospheric turbulence. Papers on microwave source efficiency. Papers on beam combining architectures, and on the material science of high-power optics. That is a multi-day program of unclassified physics. Its very existence tells you something useful. There is enough openly publishable directed energy research to fill a conference, and the field's practitioners think presenting it is worth their professional time year after year. These meetings happen in real places. The knowledge base records that DEPS has held symposia at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, including a Directed Energy Systems Symposium, and that personnel from the Air Force Research Laboratory's Directed Energy Directorate have presented papers and taught short courses there. Note what that is and is not. It is attendance and instruction on the record. It is not evidence of anything covert. One knowledge-based document, U.S. Electromagnetic Weapons and Human Rights, puts it bluntly: research on directed energy is now large enough to support a professional society of contractors and cleared defense officials, holding symposia since spring 2001. That framing calls them high-security meetings. The fuller record is more mixed, with an open track alongside a closed one. Where a source overstates, we say so, even when the source is a friendly one. The second function is publication. DEPS puts out the Journal of Directed Energy, a peer-reviewed venue that subjects this work to the same scrutiny as any other branch of applied physics. And peer review demands a particular kind of openness. A reviewer has to see the method, the data, and the reasoning well enough to judge whether the conclusions actually follow. You cannot referee what you are not allowed to read. So the journal publishes unclassified work, necessarily. But its existence still tells you something about the culture of this field. Its practitioners want citable publications. They want their names indexed, their papers refereed, their careers advanced by the ordinary machinery of academic credit. That is how a normal scientific community behaves. It is not how a hidden cabal behaves, and the difference is worth holding onto as we go further into this map. The third function is the membership itself. DEPS does not publish a searchable roll, but its committee rosters, attendee lists, and printed acknowledgments make the composition plain enough. The Society's own charter, quoted in the knowledge base, describes its purpose as the interchange of ideas and information among professionals in the directed energy community, and the promotion of education and training. Read that as a recruiting and networking function stated openly. And here is the point the chapter insists on. This blend of government, industry, and academia is not peculiar to directed energy. The American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics does it. So does the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, and SPIE, the International Society for Optics and Photonics. Missile defense and nuclear engineering meetings look the same. DPS is not unique. It is one instance of a very general pattern in American defense research. Why does that pattern hold? Because the incentives underneath it are structural. Government sets the requirements and provides the money. Industry builds hardware against those requirements. Academia supplies both the fundamental research and the trained workforce that industry and government then hire. Every serious defense technology field grows the same three-cornered institution around itself. So let us stop describing the society in the abstract and ask who is actually sitting in the room. Sit in that audience and you would see a specific recurring mix. Program managers from the directed energy offices of the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, and the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Engineers and business development staff from the large contractors. Researchers from the national laboratories, presenting work that has cleared public release review. And university faculty with their graduate students, because a professional society is also a hiring pipeline. Each group has a plain reason to be there. The program managers come to recruit talent and announce unclassified milestones. The contractors come to meet the people who write the contracts. The laboratory researchers come to build the citation record their careers depend on. The students come looking for work. Ordinary professional motives, all of them, and worth stating plainly, because the alternative reading assumes conspiracy where ambition will do. The contractors deserve a moment, because their presence is what gives the military-industrial framing its concrete shape. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and Boeing each maintain an active directed energy portfolio. Lockheed's Athena laser shot down drones in testing. Northrop Grumman was prime on the Navy's laser weapon system demonstrator. Boeing's advanced tactical laser flew aboard a C-130. These programs were announced in press releases and filmed. They are documented, not secret. Hold the registers apart here because this is where an argument like this one goes wrong. That these companies build high-power lasers is demonstrated. That they present at a symposium is documented. That anyone in that room directs energy at a private citizen is a claim, and nothing in the public record we have reviewed establishes it. Attending a conference is not evidence of wrongdoing. Publishing a paper is not evidence of wrongdoing. Behind the four big names sits a second tier that never makes headlines. Firms that grind specialty optics. Firms that manufacture the diode pumps for solid-state lasers. Firms that design cooling systems for high-power microwave sources or write the control software for beam director turrets. Without them, the prime systems are paper designs. The supply chain is deep, specialized, and spread across dozens of companies, and the symposium is one place it becomes visible. Behind the conference badges sits a specific disciplinary stack, and it is worth naming, because we will meet it again word for word when this episode reaches the 711th Human Performance Wing. At the base, the physical sciences, physics and chemistry, the study of energy, matter, and light. Without plasma physics, you cannot model a beam through air. Without quantum mechanics, you cannot design the gain medium that makes the beam. Layered on top comes engineering in 5 flavors. Electrical for the power systems and the beam steering electronics. Optical for the mirrors, lenses, combiners, and adaptive optics. Chemical, for thermal management, the cooling loops that stop a multi-kilowatt laser melting its own components. Mechanical, for the gimbals, turret housings, and vibration isolation. And materials, for the coatings and windows that must survive extreme heat without degrading the optics they exist to enable. Running through both layers are the quantitative fields, mathematics and computer science. Without the mathematics of Fourier optics, you cannot compute the far-field pattern of a phased array. Without computational fluid dynamics, you cannot model the thermal blooming that smears a high-power beam in atmosphere. Without real-time control theory, you cannot drive a deformable mirror fast enough to cancel turbulence. This is the arithmetic that makes a beam stay on a moving target. So none of this is an exotic list. Discipline for discipline, it is the skill mix of any large applied physics laboratory anywhere in the world. Fusion energy, particle accelerators, gravitational wave detectors. The same graduate programs, the same overlapping journals, the same vocabulary. And the knowledge base entry on the society is careful about where that leaves us. Its documented role, it says, is limited to organizing professional conferences and educational offerings. Hold that ordinariness in mind, because the sections ahead put this same stack inside 7 named institutions, and an ordinary skill stack, however alarming its end application, is not by itself evidence of anything beyond serious, well-funded applied science. Next we go to the companies that cut the metal, the primes' actual contracts, their dollar values, their delivery dates, and the revolving door of people who move back and forth between them. That ordinary skill stack has to build something, and somebody has to cut the metal. So the map of this ecosystem stays incomplete until we name the companies. The major defense primes maintain active, publicly acknowledged directed energy portfolios worth billions of dollars in research, development, and production contracts across the past 2 decades. None of what follows was leaked. It comes from contract announcements, company press releases, and trade press coverage. Documented, dated, and checkable. Start with Lockheed Martin, the most publicly visible of them. Its advanced test high-energy asset, known as Athena, was a ground-based fiber laser that shot down multiple fixed-wing and rotary drones in testing at White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. Fiber lasers run on electricity, so there is no chemical fuel to handle. That test record is a company account, but it was filmed at a named range before military observers. In 2018, the Army awarded Lockheed $150 million for the high-energy laser mobile demonstrator, a 100-kilowatt class system bolted onto a family of medium tactical vehicles truck. Redesignated the Indirect Fire Protection Capability High-Energy Laser, it was delivered to the Army in 2022 for operational testing. A truck, a generator, a beam director. That is what a fielded directed energy weapon actually looks like today. The Navy equivalent is Helios, the high-energy laser and integrated optical dazzler with surveillance. 60-plus kilowatts, wired into the Aegis combat system aboard Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, so the ship's own radar picture cues the beam. The contract, awarded in 2018, was worth $150 million, with options running to $943 million. Note the stated targets: drones, small boats, and optical sensors. Hardware, not people. Raytheon Technologies, renamed RTX Corporation after its 2020 merger with United Technologies, is the principal name in high-power microwave. Its counter-electronic high-power microwave extended-range air-based defense system, Chimera, is designed to engage several drones at once, disabling their electronics without destroying the airframe. That is the defining feature of microwave weapons. They attack circuits rather than structures. Hold that thought, because it is where the civilian claims later attach themselves. Raytheon's laser record is equally public. Its high-energy laser weapon system, a 50-kilowatt class laser mounted on a small all-terrain vehicle, engaged mortar rounds and drones at White Sands in 2019. In 2022, the company delivered the first operational high-energy laser weapon to the United States Air Force under that service's directed energy portfolio. Each milestone arrived with a press release, a photograph, and trade coverage. Publicity, not secrecy, is the pattern. Northrop Grumman's specialty is the unglamorous half of the problem: beam control and laser sources. It built the beam control system for the Navy's Laser Weapon System demonstrator, the solid-state laser installed aboard the USS Ponce in 2014. That was the first operational deployment of a directed energy weapon aboard an American warship. 2 years later, its solid-state laser technology maturation program reached 105 kilowatts, the power level tacticians had been waiting for. Boeing took a different road. Its advanced tactical laser was a chemical oxygen iodine system, ground-fired against targets in 2007 and flight-tested aboard a C-130 Hercules in 2009, engaging ground targets from the air. The chemical approach was then abandoned because the fuel handling was hazardous and the logistics unworkable. But Boeing's large aperture beam directors and its atmospheric propagation data fed straight into the solid-state systems that replaced it. It matters that every program just described is announced, filmed, and argued over in the open, in outlets like Defense News, Breaking Defense, and Aviation Week. Contractors then bring the unclassified portions of that work to DEPS symposia, papers on beam control, laser source efficiency, thermal management, atmospheric propagation. They go where the program managers go, and they recruit in the same rooms where graduate students present their first conference papers. Beneath the primes sits a far less visible layer of suppliers. Specialty optics firms such as IIVI Incorporated, now Coherent Corporation, make the laser gain media and optical coatings that end up inside somebody else's system without carrying their own logo. Others build the diode pumps, the cooling systems for high-power microwave sources, and the software that steers a beam director turret. Dozens of companies, thousands of engineers and technicians, spread across many states. Stacked up, the picture changes shape entirely. This is not a company. It is a supply chain with a prime integrator at the top, specialized component makers underneath, and machine shops, cooling specialists, and software houses below them. Which is why the chapter's closing line for this section lands so well. The directed energy industrial base is not a single company or a single facility. It is a sector, distributed, specialized, and durable. The knowledge base holds a human rights report that reaches the same conclusion from the opposite direction. Its author notes that directed energy research has grown large enough to sustain a professional society of private contractors and cleared Defense Department officials, holding what the report calls high-security symposiums from spring 2001 onward. That is an accurate description of the sector's scale. It is a statement about size, not an allegation against any named program. Which brings us to the part of this map people find most uncomfortable, and which is also among the best documented. Institutions do not knit themselves together. People do that by moving between them. The revolving door describes the traffic between government program offices, the contractors bidding for their contracts, and the research institutions that supply both the science and the scientists. None of it is unique to directed energy. The mechanism is simple enough to state in 4 steps. An officer or civil servant spends years running a directed energy program office. They learn the technology, the contractors, the budget cycle, and the operational requirements. On leaving, they are extremely valuable to the companies that build the hardware, precisely because they know what that office needs and which proposal language succeeds. The contractor hires them. The office loses memory. The contractor gains advantage. The traffic runs both ways. A contractor engineer who has spent a decade on a laser system may be recruited into a government office to bring that expertise inside the acquisition process. That is not corruption. Often it reflects the plain difficulty of finding anyone qualified in a field this narrow. But it does create structural conflicts of interest, which ethics rules, cooling off periods, and post-employment restrictions exist to manage imperfectly. We are not guessing at any of this. The Government Accountability Office has audited the revolving door across the Defense Department for decades. A 2008 review of defense contractor ethics programs found that the major primes employed significant numbers of former senior defense officials, and that the post-employment restrictions meant to prevent conflicts were enforced inconsistently. That is a finding about institutions and enforcement. It accuses no individual of anything. A 2019 report on the defense acquisition workforce reached a structural conclusion. Movement between government and industry, in both directions, is a persistent feature of the system, driven by two forces: technical expertise concentrated in a handful of firms, and a government that cannot match private sector salaries for top engineering talent. Fix neither and the door keeps turning. That is the honest reading. An incentive problem, documented by the government's own auditors. In directed energy specifically, you can watch the door turning in 4 public places: conference programs, patent filings, the leadership rosters of program offices and contractor divisions, and the conflict of interest statements attached to grant proposals and journal submissions. A researcher publishing in the Journal of Directed Energy may hold a Defense Department grant, sit on an advisory panel, and consult for a contractor. All of it disclosed on the record by design. Here the line has to be drawn hard. The knowledge base entry on the society is blunt about the limits of the record, and it disciplines everything else in this chapter. The society's documented role is organizing conferences and running educational programs. Targeted individuals cite it as an institutional pillar of the infrastructure they believe is turned against civilians. That inference belongs to them, and the published evidence stops well short of it. So hold two things at once. This sector is real, richly funded, staffed by thousands, and its people move between government and industry as a matter of routine. And a sector with the capability to build laser weapons is not the same claim as a sector attacking civilians. The distance between those two sentences is the entire argument. Next, we follow the money to one specific office and one sentence about internships. So the society has a name, a charter, and a calendar of symposia. Now follow the money one step back, to the office the source document names as paying for those internships. The High Energy Laser Joint Technology Office did not appear quietly, and it did not appear in secret. It was born from a specific, dated, verifiable bureaucratic process, and every step of that process sits on the public record. By the late 1990s, Congress had grown tired of paying 3 times over for the same physics. The Air Force, the Army, and the Navy each funded their own high-energy laser research. Each had its own programs, its own contractors, its own test ranges, and its own idea of what a laser weapon ought to be. Lessons learned in one service rarely crossed into another. That, to Congress, was duplication. Congress directed the Department of Defense to fix it. The remedy proposed was not more money but fewer seams. One management structure, pooling the science and technology funding that 3 services were already spending separately. Nothing in that instruction concerns targeting anybody. It concerns budget lines. Hold on to that, because for the rest of this section the documented record and the claims made about it have to be kept firmly apart. Here are the dates, and they matter because a date is what makes a claim checkable. A high-energy laser executive review panel delivered its master plan on the 24th of March 2000. The Joint Office stood up in June of that year. The Directed Energy Professional Society, the Knowledge Base Records, began holding its symposia in the spring of 2001. Each of those is independently verifiable. The panel was not an outside investigation. It was made up of senior science and technology officials from inside the department, asked to assess laser weapons research across all 3 services and to recommend a better management structure. Its central recommendation was a single joint office. The department then acted with unusual speed. Roughly 3 months separated the master plan landing on desks from the new office opening its doors. The office that resulted has a name longer than its job. Its charter is to manage the joint portfolio of laser weapons science and technology funding, to coordinate research across the services, to avoid duplication, and to move promising laboratory results toward fielded capability. Pool the money, coordinate the effort, waste less. That is the entire remit, written down in public and reviewed like any other line in the defense budget. It is worth pausing on how ordinary that origin story is. A congressional instruction, a review panel, published master plan, a stood-up office. It is the same machinery that produces joint offices for cybersecurity, for hypersonics, for any technology area Congress decides needs better coordination. Nothing in the sequence is unusual. That is precisely why it can be checked, and why this chapter is able to rest on it. So the first register of this section is the plainest one. Demonstrated. A named office, a named panel, a dated master plan, a published charter, all of it retrievable by anybody who cares to look. If a covert program of attacks on civilians existed somewhere in this world, this is not the office in which it would be written down. What is written down here is procurement management, and we should say that clearly before going further. The oversight trail exists because the office exists. Its budget appears in the annual defense appropriation. Its programs have been examined by the Government Accountability Office and described in reports from the Congressional Research Service. Congress told the Pentagon to create it, and so Congress can ask what it does with the money. That accountability is real. It is also narrow. It covers spending and management, not every experiment carried out downstream of it. Here is the sentence this whole section turns on, quoted directly from the source document held in the knowledge base. One line, two acronyms. Strip the acronyms away and it describes something almost mundane. A government office paying to place students at research sites so that they graduate into the workforce that office needs. That is the claim on the page. Now watch how much of it can actually be checked. The knowledge base copy of that document says a little more. The internships, it says, concern the research, development, and testing of high-energy laser and high-power microwave components, systems and effects, at federal laboratories and universities at sites around the country. The Society's own material describes interns working in laboratories under the tutelage of full-time researchers in physics, materials science, mathematics, and computer science. Students in laboratories doing supervised research. The Department of Defense runs dozens of programs built on exactly this model. The SMART Scholarship for Science, Mathematics, and Research for Transformation pays undergraduate and graduate tuition in science and engineering in exchange for a commitment to work in a defense laboratory afterwards. The National Defense Science and Engineering Graduate Fellowship, administered by the Office of Naval Research, funds 3 years of graduate study. Both are public, competitive, and openly advertised. What makes this internship line worth sustained attention is not that it is sinister. It is that it is precise. It names a funder. It names a program type. And it names 7 specific host institutions. That precision is exactly what turns a vague suspicion about the military-industrial complex into something a reader can test. Each of those 7 names has its own public fact sheet, and in this chapter each has been checked. Keep the registers apart. That the Society exists, that it holds symposia with closed sessions, that a joint office funds student internships. All of that is documented, and none of it is evidence that anyone was attacked. The claim that this ecosystem directs covert harm at individuals is a separate claim, resting on testimony and inference. It is fair to state it. It is not fair to smuggle it in. Now the distribution, and it is a small but genuinely checkable piece of data. The 7 host institutions are not clustered under a single service branch. The Air Force contributes 3 of them. The Army contributes 2. The Navy contributes 2. 3, 2, 2. A single service program would concentrate its internships inside its own institutions. A genuinely joint program spreads them across the others, which is exactly what this list does. The Air Force sites are the 711th Human Performance Wing, the Air Force Institute of Technology in Ohio, and the Air Force Research Laboratory itself in New Mexico and in Hawaii. The Army sites are the Army Research Laboratory in Maryland and the Space and Missile Defense Command. The Navy sites are the Naval Research Laboratory and the Naval Postgraduate School in California. 7 institutions, and every one of them a public body. Why 3 for the Air Force? Because that is where the research weight sits. The Directed Energy Directorate at Kirtland in New Mexico is the single largest concentration of directed energy research in the Department of Defense. Its staff present at society symposia and teach its short courses, which is what laboratory researchers in any technical field do. The internship count tracks the research effort. It does not evidence anything more. The Army's 2 sites align with the Army's directed energy interests: missile defense and countering small drones. The Army Research Laboratory in Maryland does the underlying science. The Space and Missile Defense Command owns the mission that would eventually use it. Nothing in either published mandate concerns civilians, and nothing in either institution's public record describes work against them. Where that boundary gets crossed, it is crossed by claim, not by document. The Navy's interests run to ship-based laser defense and to maritime surveillance, and its 2 internship sites reflect that. The Naval Research Laboratory builds and tests. The Naval Postgraduate School at Monterey educates officers rather than building hardware. In 2010, it hosted the Directed Energy Symposium, co-sponsored by the Joint Office, with both open and closed sessions, a detail recorded in the knowledge base, and one worth remembering later. So the distribution of internships tracks the distribution of research effort across the 3 services, which is exactly what a program designed to feed a workforce would look like. That is what these numbers show, and it is all they show. They say nothing whatever about targeting anyone. Next, each of those 7 institutions is taken in turn and measured against its own public record, beginning with the wing whose entire remit is human effects. That 3-2-2 split across the services tells you how the internships are distributed. It does not tell you where the interns come from. No laboratory grows its own physicists. Every one of those 7 institutions draws on the same upstream supply, American graduate schools, and specifically the graduate programs that the Department of Defense helps pay for. To finish the map, we have to leave the fence line and walk onto a campus. The connection between university research and defense needs is neither covert nor unusual. It is the ordinary operating procedure of the American Research University, and it runs through named, documented channels. The Defense University Research Instrumentation Program, the Multidisciplinary University Research Initiative, and the individual grants awarded by the service research offices, the Army Research Office, the Office of Naval Research, and the Air Force Office of Scientific Research. Every one of those is publicly advertised. In fiscal year 2023, the Department of Defense obligated roughly $2.7 billion in basic research funding, and the majority of it flowed to universities. That is basic research alone, the earliest, least applied end of the pipeline, before anything becomes a program, let alone a weapon. It is a large number, it is a public number, and it buys, above everything else, trained people who will spend careers in this field. Directed energy money reaches specific, named campuses. The University of Michigan Center for Ultrafast Optical Science, funded in part by the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, studies high-intensity laser matter interactions, physics that matters equally to directed energy applications and to fundamental science. That dual relevance is the point. The same experiment can advance a doctoral thesis and a weapons program, and the researcher at the bench is doing legitimate open science either way. 2 more. The University of Central Florida's College of Optics and Photonics is the largest optics program in the United States, and has drawn sustained funding from the Air Force Research Laboratory and the Office of Naval Research for Laser Source Development, beam combining, and nonlinear optics, and the University of New Mexico sits in Albuquerque, minutes from Kirtland Air Force Base, feeding graduates straight into the Air Force laboratory next door. Follow one student through it. A doctoral candidate takes an Air Force research grant, works for 4 years on laser source efficiency or atmospheric propagation, publishes in peer-reviewed journals, defends a thesis anyone can read, then graduates into a job at the Air Force Research Laboratory, a defense contractor, or a laser program. Open work becomes the intellectual foundation for classified work behind the fences at Kirtland or Wright-Patterson. Nothing in that sequence is hidden. You can trace this yourself. The Federal Procurement Data System lists contract awards. The National Science Foundation's Higher Education Research and Development Survey reports how much defense money each university receives. Individual university offices of sponsored research publish their own award lists. The data is public. It is also fragmented, inconsistently labeled, and tedious to aggregate, which is why so few people ever assemble it, and why the assembled picture surprises them. Keep the registers apart because this is where careless arguments collapse. Documented, the grants, the centers, the survey data, all verifiable today. Inference: that a pipeline of this size could staff a covert program without anyone noticing. Unsupported, that it does. The first is a fact, the second is an argument you may find strong or weak, and the third is a claim nobody in this chapter has evidence for. The knowledge base holds a wider file on this. Its entry on the Pentagon's Minerva initiative describes a collection of projects designed to involve universities in topics of interest to the Pentagon, social science in that case, rather than optics. Its entry on the Army's Collaborative Technology Alliances describes standing partnerships binding government, industry, and academic institutions together on foundational research. Directed energy is one instance of a pattern that spans the whole research economy. So hold the finding precisely. What the academic record establishes is a continuous, legitimate, generational mechanism for staffing directed energy research. It establishes that the expertise exists in quantity, distributed across dozens of campuses and laboratories. It establishes nothing whatsoever about what any individual graduate does afterwards. A person who studied beam control and now holds a clearance is a professional, not a suspect. Attending a symposium, publishing a paper, taking a grant, none of that is wrongdoing. Which brings us to money, and to a question the source document cannot answer. It never gives a dollar figure for the directed energy internship program itself. So we do the next best thing, we size the office that funds it. The High Energy Laser Joint Technology Office publishes enough for that, because Congress requires it to. Following the money here is not investigative journalism. It is reading appropriation documents carefully and in order. The office's annual budget, pooled from contributions by all 3 services, has been reported in the tens of millions of dollars. That figure appears in defense appropriation documents, in Government Accountability Office reports, and in the unclassified budget justifications each service submits to Congress every year. The exact number moves with the fortunes of major programs. The order of magnitude does not. Tens of millions, consistently, not hundreds, and certainly not billions. Put that in perspective. This is not the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, whose annual budget runs to several $billion. It is not the Missile Defense Agency, which is larger still. For comparison, the knowledge base records that the Strategic Defense Initiative Organization managed $20.9 billion through fiscal year 1991. The Laser Joint Office is a coordinating body with a modest budget, doing the unglamorous work of stopping 3 services duplicating each other. Following the money also shows what the money is stated to buy. The office's budget justifications submitted to Congress each year describe laser source development, beam control research, atmospheric propagation modeling, lethality testing, and the infrastructure that makes all of it possible: laboratories, test ranges, computing time. A Defense Science Board task force on directed energy urged exactly this kind of concentration, recommending that funding be focused rather than spread thinly across many projects. Now the honest part. None of the publicly available budget documents describes funding for human subjects research aimed at civilian targets. Not one line. That absence does not prove such funding does not exist. Classified budget lines exist precisely so that some spending is invisible. But it does mean the public record, the record a serious researcher can cite in a courtroom or a hearing, contains no evidence of it. Here the documentary trail stops. From money to ground. Kirtland Air Force Base sits on the southeastern edge of Albuquerque, New Mexico. A city of 500,000 people, 5,000 feet up in the high desert of the Rio Grande Valley. The base covers more than 50,000 acres. Runways, training ranges, research buildings, the administrative machinery of a major installation. But only one organization inside that perimeter matters for this chapter, and it has an address. The Air Force Research Laboratory is one of the principal scientific organizations in the Department of Defense. Roughly 10,000 people, spread across multiple directorates and multiple sites nationwide. Its Directed Energy Directorate is headquartered at the Phillips Research Site on Kirtland, and it is the largest single concentration of directed energy research staff and funding anywhere in the department. The knowledge base holds its Air Force fact sheet, titled, Without Embarrassment, Developing Speed-of-Light Weaponry. By the Directorate's own public reckoning, it runs on an annual budget in excess of $300 million, with a workforce of more than 800 people split across 2 sites. $300 million a year is not a rounding error. It is comparable to the research budget of a mid-sized university, and a figure that size appears in the Air Force appropriation, in departmental budget overviews, and in periodic accountability office reviews. What does $300 million a year actually pay for? The public fact sheets describe 3 lines of work. Solid-state lasers, slabs, disks, and fibers, plus the beam combining techniques that let several modest lasers add their output into one powerful beam. High-power microwave sources and the antennas that radiate them. And electro-optics, the sensors that find a target, the adaptive optics that unpick atmospheric blur, the beam directors that aim. The microwave work has a name for its purpose. Counter-electronics, disabling an enemy's sensors and radios without blowing anything up. None of this is a secret agenda. It is the published foundation beneath the Navy's Laser Weapon System Demonstrator, the Army's Indirect Fire Protection Capability Laser, and the Air Force's Self-Protect High-Energy Laser Demonstrator. The Directorate builds the physics. The services field the weapons. Next, its other site, a volcano in Hawaii. Leave Albuquerque now and travel half a world west. On the summit of Haleakala, the dormant volcano that fills the eastern half of Maui, the Air Force Research Laboratory keeps its other directed energy site. It is called the Air Force Maui Optical and Supercomputing Facility, AMOS. 10,000 feet up, above most of the weather, the air is thin, dry, and unusually still. That stillness is the whole point for an observatory. The centerpiece is the Advanced Electro-Optical System Telescope, 3.6 meters of aperture, 75 tons of moving instrument, and by the Air Force's own description the largest optical telescope in the Department of Defense. Around it stands a cluster of smaller instruments, from 0.4 of a meter to 1.6 meters, each tuned to a different observing job. This is documented hardware on a published fact sheet with an address. The second half of the name matters as much as the first. AMOS runs a substantial supercomputing operation, and it exists because the telescopes generate more data than people can read. Orbital mechanics models predict where a satellite will be. Follow the pipeline end to end. Photons land on a mirror. Detectors turn them into numbers. Software removes atmospheric blur, models the orbit, and merges the result with other sensors until an unknown streak becomes a cataloged object with a name and a track. That is space domain awareness, knowing what is in orbit and what it is doing. It is surveillance of machines in a vacuum hundreds of kilometers above anybody's house. Here is the part that has to be said plainly, because the name of the parent directorate invites the opposite conclusion. AMOS sits under the Directed Energy Directorate. It is not, by any public account, a directed energy weapons test range. Its published mission is watching space. The lasers live in New Mexico. The telescope on Haleakala is an eye. Sharing a boss on an organization chart is not the same as sharing a mission. The knowledge base holds the Air Force's own Directed Energy Directorate fact sheet, and it lists 3 telescope sites in one sentence: the Starfire Optical Range at Kirtland, North Oscura Peak at White Sands, and the Maui Space Surveillance Site. The Directorate describes them as the largest and most sophisticated telescope facilities in the Defense Department. That claim is a boast about optics published openly in a document anyone can download today. There is a genuine link, and it is narrow. Correcting atmospheric blur for a telescope imaging a satellite is close kin to correcting it for a laser trying to stay focused at distance. Both measure turbulence in real time, compute a correction, and push it through a deformable mirror faster than the air can change. The knowledge base's DARPA Technology Transition History records exactly that lineage. Shared physics, different purposes, say both parts. That same archive, describing the Space Surveillance Telescope installed alongside the Maui Complex, a DARPA and Air Force Research Laboratory collaboration, puts the boundary in one careful sentence. Note the shape of it. A capability could theoretically be turned around. No evidence exists that it has been. Both halves are true, and dropping the second half is how a documented telescope quietly becomes an undocumented weapon in the retelling. That step is an inference, not a finding. Keep 3 registers apart every time for the rest of this episode. Documented. Named laboratories, apertures, budget lines, dates, all independently checkable. Technical. A shared physics base between imaging and beam control, which proves kinship and nothing more. Claimed. That this apparatus is turned on private citizens. That third register is testimony and inference. It is not established by the first 2, and it will not become established by repetition, however sincere. Now leave the Pacific and come back to the Eastern Seaboard. 2 of the 4 laboratories on the source documents list belong to the other services, and their institutional memories run deeper than most of the Air Force chart we have been tracing. One sits in a Maryland suburb northeast of Washington. The other sits on the Potomac and has been there since before radar, before television, before the Second World War. The Army Research Laboratory is headquartered in Adelphi, Maryland, just northeast of the District of Columbia. It took its present shape in 1992, when the Army folded several older organizations into one command: the Harry Diamond Laboratories, the Ballistic Research Laboratory, the Materials Technology Laboratory, and parts of others. That merger is the sort of administrative fact that never makes news, and it explains more about this world than any leaked document. Its public portfolio is wide: materials science, electronics, sensors, computational science, and the piece that matters here, human research and engineering sciences, the Army's own bioeffects and human performance arm. That directorate is real, it is named, and it studies how energy and equipment affect soldiers. What it studies in detail is a question for the record, not for guesswork. We will treat it the same way we treated the telescope on the volcano. ARL is not a directed energy laboratory in the way the Air Force Directorate is. Its beam work sits inside a much larger materials, electronics, and sensors portfolio, and it points at counter-rocket and counter-drone problems rather than the big lasers that dominate Air Force and Navy programs. The knowledge base holds an Army-directed energy training report from 1986, written by a contractor. Even the doctrine paperwork here is decades old and unclassified. The Naval Research Laboratory is the oldest institution on this whole map. It was established in 1923 at the urging of Thomas Edison, who argued that the Navy needed scientists of its own rather than borrowed ones. It still occupies a campus on the Potomac in Washington. Its charter was simply to do physical science for the Navy, and it has been doing that without interruption for slightly more than a century. Set the date side by side and the shape of it changes. Radar, then satellite navigation, the ancestor of the GPS in your pocket, then satellite surveillance, all out of one Navy laboratory. The Maui station passes from DRPA to the Air Force in the early 1980s. The Army consolidates in '92. Only in 2001 does a professional society appear to hold the field's first closed-door symposiums. The laboratories came first. That century of Navy physics is worth pausing on, because it answers a question people rarely ask out loud. Why does a laboratory like this exist at all? Because in 1923 nobody could buy radar or satellites or beam control from a catalog. The state built the capability because the market had not invented it yet. The same logic, 100 years later, funds the work we are about to count. For laboratories, then, form the physical backbone the source document describes. The Air Force Research Laboratory, the Army Research Laboratory, the Naval Research Laboratory, and the Naval Postgraduate School, which we reach shortly. Not one secret facility. A distributed, multi-service, multi-decade laboratory system doing applied physics that long predates the directed energy weapons argument itself. Each has a public fact sheet. Each has a street address. Each can be found with a search engine. So what does this system cost? Start with the narrowest figure. The Air Force Research Laboratory's Directed Energy Directorate alone reports more than $300 million a year. That is the directed energy line, not the whole laboratory. The Army Research Laboratory's total, across every research area it touches, runs to roughly $1 billion annually. The Naval Research Laboratory is similar in scale. These are published numbers, not estimates from outside. Stack them carefully and mind what each layer means. The High Energy Laser Joint Technology Office adds tens of millions in cross-service coordination. The 711th Human Performance Wing, which the next section examines, adds hundreds of millions more. Add conservatively, and the annual public spend across the institutions named in this chapter lands somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion, depending on what you count and how you categorize it. Put that in proportion. It is comparable to what America spends yearly on fusion research or particle physics. It is not the Manhattan Project, and it is not a shoestring in a converted hangar. A program that size leaves paper, budget justifications to Congress, contract awards, accountability office reviews, press releases, catalog theses. The knowledge base notes the Department of Defense passing $1.5 billion a year by 2024. Next, the Human Effects Wing. We have been looking at a professional society. Its symposia, its membership, its place inside a funded research economy. The chapter now narrows from the society to a single institution, one you can find on a map with an activation date and a budget. It is the 711th Human Performance Wing of the United States Air Force. Everything about it is public. What that public record proves and what it does not is the whole question. The Air Force activated the wing at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, near Dayton, Ohio, on the 26th of March, 2008. It merged two existing organizations, the Human Effectiveness Directorate and the School of Aerospace Medicine. The Air Force described the result in its own words as the first human-centric warfare wing. That phrase is theirs, not ours, and it is a matter of public record rather than a leak or a rumor. Read that phrase carefully. Human-centric warfare wing does not mean a wing that makes weapons to use on humans. It means an organization whose subject is the human being inside the machine, the pilot, the operator, the crew. Aerospace medicine, human systems integration, bioeffects. Under one command in a purpose-built facility. The phrase is arresting, and it has been quoted often in this community. Quoting it accurately means resisting the temptation to make it say more. 3 domains sit under that single command. Aerospace medicine, which keeps aircrew alive at altitude. human systems integration, which fits the machine to the person operating it, and bioeffects research, which measures what energy does to tissue. The first two are uncontroversial. The third is the one this chapter is about, and the honest thing to say is that it is uncontroversial too, right up until you ask what the measurements are eventually used for. 680,000 square feet. That is the approximate footprint of the purpose-built facility that houses the wing. It is a useful number because scale is the part of this story that people underestimate. This is not a back room. It is a campus with laboratories, budgets, contracts, and a staff. Scale, though, proves capacity and nothing else. A large research building is evidence of large research, not of what the research is aimed at. The Texas thread runs a long way back. Brooks Field opened in San Antonio in 1917, a flight training field and medical research center for the Army Air Service. For most of the 20th century, it was the institutional home of American aerospace medicine, wartime pilot selection, pressure suits for high-altitude flight, and the human factors work that went with the space program. That history is documented, ordinary, and largely a story about keeping aircrew alive. In 2005, the Base Realignment and Closure Commission recommended moving the School of Aerospace Medicine out of Brooks and up to Wright-Patterson, consolidating Air Force medical research alongside the human effectiveness work already in Ohio. The relocation was substantially finished around 2011. Brooks City Base, as it had become, was handed back to San Antonio. None of that is secret. It sits in a public commission report that anyone can download today. So there is a discrepancy, and it is worth naming. The source document this chapter works from lists the wing's location as Texas. The wing was activated in Ohio. That is not a lie in the source. It is a snapshot, taken while the consolidation was still underway and the Aerospace Medicine School still sat in San Antonio. Accurate for its moment. Dated now. Both things are true at once. This matters beyond one line in one document. A great deal of the material in this field circulates as photocopies of photocopies, decades old, passed hand to hand. Institutions move. They merge, they get renamed, they close. A citation that was right in 2006 can read as an error in 2026 without anyone having lied. Checking the date of a source before deciding it is wrong or dishonest is basic discipline. The chapter now does something simple and rather clever. It reproduces, word for word, the list of academic disciplines the source document gives for internships in this field. Science, physics and chemistry, engineering, electrical, optical, chemical, mechanical and materials, then mathematics and computer science. That is the whole list. Read it twice because the argument here rests on what is missing from that list quite as much as on what is in it. 9 disciplines, and every one of them is the sort of thing you would find on the faculty roster of any large engineering physics graduate program in the country. There is no exotic entry, no parapsychology, no consciousness studies, no discipline that exists only in this field. It is, discipline for discipline, the same stack we named earlier for the Directed Energy Professional Society's own membership. The list is unremarkable, and that is the point. Put jobs to those disciplines and the picture becomes concrete. Physicists model how electromagnetic energy interacts with tissue. Chemists analyze the biochemical response to exposure. Electrical engineers build the sensors. Optical engineers shape and deliver laser energy. Chemical and mechanical engineers manage heat and structure in high-power systems. Materials engineers develop protective equipment. Mathematicians and computer scientists model, simulate, and control the whole multivariable mess. That is a real workforce doing real work. So what does the disciplinary list actually establish? It establishes that a substantial scientific workforce sits behind this field, trained in ordinary subjects, producing ordinary outputs. Papers, conference presentations, technical reports, and the classified equivalents of all three. The knowledge base puts it plainly in one report on electromagnetic weapons and human rights. What the list does not establish is how any of that knowledge is finally used, or by whom or under what authority. The outputs stack roughly in 4 layers. Peer-reviewed papers at the top, fully public. Below that, symposium talks and contractor reports, technically open but rarely read outside the field. Below that, meetings restricted to United States government employees and their contractors. The knowledge base notes one directed energy conference limited on exactly those terms. And at the bottom, classified work, which by definition we cannot see or characterize. For layers, decreasing visibility. Now the chapter turns, and it turns towards fairness. Hearing the word bioeffects, it is easy to assume offense only. A great deal of this work exists to protect people. Laser safety limits, the maximum permissible exposure values published by the American National Standards Institute in its Z136 series, exist because somebody had to measure in a laboratory how much energy an eye or a patch of skin absorbs before it is injured. The method is unglamorous, and it is the same everywhere. Expose tissue under controlled conditions, varying wavelength, pulse duration, and energy density. Find the threshold at which damage begins. Divide by a safety factor. Publish the result as a limit. That limit then protects a technician aligning a low-power research laser, and equally protects a service member working near a high-power weapon system. Decades of measurement stand behind a single number. Radiofrequency energy works the same way. The Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers publishes Standard C95.1. The International Commission on Non-Ionicing Radiation Protection publishes its own guidelines. Both set human exposure limits for radiofrequency fields, and both rest on decades of measured biological effects research. Every country that operates high-power radar, laser, or communications equipment relies on that literature to keep its own personnel safe. The standards are freely available to read. Here is the uncomfortable part, stated plainly. The same body of knowledge is dual use by its nature. It tells you how much energy is safe, which is what you need to set a protective limit. And it tells you how much energy causes harm, which is what a weapon designer would need. One literature, 2 readings. That is not a conspiracy. It is the ordinary condition of applied physics, and it has always been so. That is the knowledge base's own summary, and it is the fairest sentence in this whole chapter. It does not dismiss the claim, and it does not endorse it. Nothing in the activation of a wing, the size of a building, or a list of 9 academic disciplines demonstrates that anyone is directing energy at civilians. Nor does the existence of classified work prove it. This is exactly where the evidence runs out. So hold 2 things at once without letting either collapse into the other. A capability sector exists, funded, staffed, documented, and hiding very little of its ordinary science. Whether anything within it is aimed at private citizens is a separate question, and it needs separate evidence. Attending a symposium is not a crime. Publishing a paper is not an accusation. What follows keeps testing that line, institution by institution, document by document. So the knowledge is dual use. Now step back and read the 711th Human Performance Wing's public mission whole, because it has 2 stated halves, and they pull in opposite directions on purpose. One half exists to protect people from directed energy. The other exists to make people perform better. Both are printed plainly on the wing's own fact sheets. Neither on its own is sinister. Holding both in view at once is the work of this section. The first half is protective. It sets exposure limits, safety standards, and medical screening protocols for the people who operate high-power lasers, radars, and radio systems, so that they do not harm themselves or anyone standing nearby. This is industrial hygiene. It is the same category of work that occupational health and safety agencies perform in every industrialized country, applied here to the particular hazards of directed energy hardware. Documented, public, and entirely ordinary. What makes the hazards particular is the physics. A radar beam that is safe at 50 meters may not be safe at 5. A laser that is harmless when it scatters can blind when it reflects. Somebody has to measure those thresholds, publish them, and turn them into a rule an airman can follow. That measuring is the protective mandate, and the knowledge base holds the published standards that this work feeds, from laser limits to radio frequency guidelines. Picture the roles rather than the org chart. A laser safety officer at an Air Force base, checking that a beam path is enclosed. A bioenvironmental engineer measuring radio frequency exposure around a radar installation. A flight surgeon screening aircrew for vulnerability to directed energy effects. 3 jobs, all of them about preventing harm, all of them staffed by people whose professional purpose is that nobody gets hurt. Research supporting those roles is not evidence of malevolent intent. The second half is developmental. Human systems integration research, aimed at making pilots and operators perform better under real operational stress. Cockpit displays that present information the way a pilot's attention actually works. Fatigue management built on circadian and sleep physiology. Decision support tools that filter the flood of data a modern crew receives. Training methods drawn from the cognitive and behavioral sciences. All of it documented on public fact sheets, all of it unremarkable. Set the 2 mandates side by side and the tension is visible without being sinister. One side measures how much energy a body can take before it is injured. The other measures how much performance a body can give before it fails. The same wing, the same building, the same disciplines. And the stated goal of that second column, enhanced human performance, is the very phrase that opened this chapter on a DARPA chart. Here is the honest gap this section leaves open. Neither mandate, protective, or developmental describes in any public record reviewed for this chapter a program aimed at a private, unconsenting civilian. The Wing's portfolio concerns the Air Force's own personnel using the Air Force's own systems. A crash test laboratory's record does not prove it has expanded to driving cars at pedestrians. That is where the documented material stops, and the claim begins. Which brings us back to the chart this chapter opened on. A cold open quotes a document. It does not read it. So return to the DARPA progression and look at it more slowly, stage by stage, asking of each stage the only 2 questions that matter here. What is publicly documented? And what is being inferred from it? The answers are not the same, and the difference is the whole chapter. The source document lays out 5 stages. Behavior first, then a biosilico interface, where living tissue meets engineered electronics. Then the brain itself as a technology. And then 2 declared end states. Enhanced human performance and enhanced system performance. Read plainly, it is a research trajectory, an arc from understanding how people behave to engineering how well they operate. Read carelessly, it becomes a staircase to something the chart never says. And the first thing to say is that the underlying research is real. DARPA has publicly funded neurotechnology and brain-computer interface work for decades, through its Biological Technologies Office and the programs that preceded it. These are not leaked programs. They are named, budgeted, announced in press releases and covered in the trade press. Anyone can read the program pages. That is an unusual foundation for a secret, and it is worth saying clearly. 3 program names anchor the ladder, and each has a date. 2006, Revolutionizing Prosthetics. 2014, Systems-Based Neurotechnology for Emerging Therapies known as subnets. 2018, Next Generation Non-Surgical Neurotechnology, known as N3. Behind them sits an agency founded in 1958 in the panic after Sputnik. Dates, budget lines, published papers. This is the documented register, and it is worth walking through one program at a time. Revolutionizing Prosthetics launched in 2006 with a blunt goal. Give an amputee a robotic arm they could control directly with their nervous system. It worked. Recipients moved a mechanical hand by intention through an implanted neural interface in demonstrations reported openly and published in the medical literature. Whatever else you conclude about this field, hold that result honestly. Reading a motor signal out of a human brain is a solved problem. Subnets followed in 2014, funding research into deep brain stimulation for psychiatric conditions, treatment-resistant depression, post-traumatic stress. Electrodes placed surgically inside a hospital with consent forms, ethics review, and results published in peer-reviewed journals. Note what that program required: neurosurgery. Physical access to a patient who agreed. The register here stays documented, and the distance between that and anything done remotely to someone who never consented is the distance this chapter keeps measuring. N3 from 2018 is the one that makes targeted individuals sit forward. Its stated aim is a brain-computer interface needing no surgery, reading and writing neural signals from outside the skull, using electromagnetic or acoustic approaches. That is a publicly announced research goal for equipped, consenting military operators. It is not a demonstrated device pointed at strangers. The program's existence proves ambition and funding. It does not prove deployment against anyone. The knowledge base notes that this research area has drawn sustained scrutiny from civil liberties and neurorights advocates, who argue human performance modification could be turned to coercive or non-consensual ends. That is a legitimate policy argument about institutions and incentives, and it is being made in public by named organizations in the open. It is not the same as evidence that any particular person has been targeted. Keep those two things apart. Which takes us west to Monterey, California, and to the one institution on today's map that is not a laboratory at all. The Naval Postgraduate School sits on a campus overlooking the Pacific from the Monterey Peninsula. It is a school accredited, degree-granting, with a library and a course catalog. It grants real master's and doctoral degrees, almost entirely to serving military officers sent there to become better technically trained before returning to the fleet. The school was founded in 1909 at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, moved to Monterey in 1951, and has granted graduate degrees ever since. The knowledge base describes it as the Navy's primary graduate-level research university, evolved from a marine engineering school. Its curriculum spans what a modern Navy needs: systems engineering, operations research, computer science, physics, electrical engineering, and, centrally for this chapter, space systems and remote sensing. 2 units matter here. The Space Systems Academic Group runs a master's program covering orbital mechanics, satellite design, space communications, and the sensor physics behind space-based surveillance. The Remote Sensing Center researches imaging, signal processing, and the electromagnetic propagation physics that determines what a sensor in orbit can actually see. Both are listed on the school's own pages. Both are the ordinary business of a Navy that depends on satellites and sensors. Officers at Monterey write real theses, publicly cataloged, many unclassified and searchable in the school's own library system. A thesis on adaptive optics for laser propagation through atmospheric turbulence. A thesis on designing high-power microwave antennas. A thesis on the biological effects of radiofrequency exposure. That is the bridge from a graduate seminar to the directed energy enterprise this chapter has been mapping, and it is a bridge made of documents. So pause on what NPS is not. It is not a weapons development facility. Its contribution to this field is train people, not fielded hardware, and the officer who writes that thesis may carry it to a program office, or to AFRL, or to NRL. That distinction recalibrates the whole map. Not 7 identical black boxes, but a mixed ecosystem of laboratories, a funding office, a society, a school, and one command in Alabama still to place on it. From Monterey we travel east, to the 7th and last institution on the source documents list. It is the Army Space and Missile Defense Command, headquartered at Redstone Arsenal outside Huntsville, Alabama. If Monterey trains officers and Kirtland runs the physics, Huntsville is where the Army has kept its rockets and its missiles for 3/4 of a century. It is the oldest address on our map, and by some distance the busiest. Huntsville's connection to rocketry begins in 1950, when a team of German engineers led by Wernher von Braun was transferred from Fort Bliss, in Texas, to Redstone Arsenal. Von Braun had designed the V-2 rocket that fell on London during the war. He would later design the Saturn V that carried astronauts to the moon. That team became the nucleus of the Army's ballistic missile development effort in northern Alabama, and it never left. The Army Ballistic Missile Agency was established at Redstone in 1956. Through the late 1950s, it developed the Redstone, Jupiter, and Pershing missile systems, and when the National Aeronautics and Space Administration created its Marshall Space Flight Center in 1960, the core of Marshall staff came straight from that Army agency. The same campus, the same engineers, a different letterhead. Huntsville has been both a military and a civil space town ever since. That history is worth stating plainly because it is easy to make it do work it cannot do. A campus with a rocket lineage is not, by itself, evidence of anything covert. Every major spacefaring nation has one. What the lineage does establish is capacity. Continuous engineering money, continuous physics, and a workforce in one place for 75 years. Capacity is real, and it is documented. Capacity is not the same thing as intent. Redstone today is a crowded place. The Missile Defense Agency is there. So is the National Aeronautics and Space Administration's Marshall Space Flight Center. Tens of thousands of military, civilian, and contractor personnel pass through the gates on an average working day. That density is the point. Institutions that share a fence line share cafeterias, car parks, conferences, and careers, and the boundaries between their programs become administrative rather than physical. The Space and Missile Defense Command's publicly stated portfolio has 3 declared parts: space operations, missile defense, and directed energy technology development. None of that is inferred. It sits on the command's own fact sheets. The knowledge base entry for the command adds structural detail. 2 air and missile defense commands, the Army's only space brigade, and a technical center at Redstone that conducts research into high-energy lasers and high-power microwaves. That is the record's own language. The command has historically served as the Army's executive agent for high-energy laser demonstration programs. The same category of work the Joint Technology Office was created to coordinate across the services. So the last institution on the list closes a loop opened much earlier in this chapter. Congress mandates coordination in March 2000. A joint office stands up in June, and an Army command in Alabama runs demonstrations under that architecture. With Huntsville and Monterey added, the spread is hard to miss. Albuquerque and Kirtland in New Mexico, Maui in Hawaii, Adelphi in Maryland, Washington itself, Monterey in California, Huntsville in Alabama, Wright-Patterson in Ohio, 6 states and the District of Columbia. Every one of those addresses is independently documented, and every one is reachable by anybody willing to type an institution's name into a search engine. No clearance is required, and no leak. Break the list down by kind rather than by place and it sorts cleanly. 3 are genuine laboratories: the Air Force Research Laboratory, the Naval Research Laboratory, the Army Research Laboratory. 2 are schools: the Air Force Institute of Technology and the Naval Postgraduate School. 1 is a wing that studies human effects. 1 is an Army command. And 1, the Directed Energy Professional Society, is not government at all. It is a membership body. Lay the whole list out at once and the shape of the thing becomes clear. 8 organizations, 3 services, 1 field. That is what the source document's internship line, read carefully, actually points at. Not a rumor, not a leak, but a set of employers who take students. The value of laying it out this way is not drama. It is that each entry can be checked, and therefore each entry can be wrong. Notice the character of the network. It is not one hidden laboratory, run by one agency under one program name. It is distributed. The two big laboratories do the core physics. The Joint Technology Office coordinates the funding. The professional society provides the venue. The postgraduate school trains the workforce. The Human Performance Wing studies effects on people. The Army's two organizations contribute service-specific expertise. Different roles, one field, and a shared technical vocabulary. Every one of these 8 organizations has a public fact sheet, an official web page, and in most cases a documented congressional oversight history. That checkability is the entire point of building a map instead of simply asserting that the military-industrial complex is behind this. A vague accusation cannot be verified, and it cannot be falsified either, which is precisely what makes it useless. A named list can be tested. This one has been. A knowledge-based document titled U.S. Electromagnetic Weapons and Human Rights puts the same observation more bluntly. It says the level of research on directed energy is now large enough to support a professional society made up of private contractors and Defense Department officials with security clearances, holding symposia since spring 2001. Note what that sentence claims. Scale, membership, and meetings. It does not claim anything about civilians, and we should not read that in. The Directed Energy Professional Society itself sits in New Mexico, close to the Air Force laboratory it grew up beside. It gives the field a public face. Symposia, a journal, a membership roll, an exhibition floor where industry, government, and universities show their work. A knowledge base entry on the Society's modeling and simulation conference notes that by organizing classified events, it enabled collaboration that official government channels alone might not have produced. Here is where discipline is required. A professional society that exists, holds conferences, and lobbies for research funding is behaving like every professional society in every technical field on Earth. Chemists do it. Civil engineers do it. That behavior is not proof of a covert program against private citizens. The inference that this ecosystem could sustain such a program is an inference. Reasonable to state, but an inference, and this series keeps saying so. Now the oversight trail, because it does work, nothing else in this chapter can. The record traceable to these institutions is not one report. It is a pattern of documentation spanning more than 2 decades. The Government Accountability Office, the GAO, the auditing arm of Congress, has reviewed directed energy programs in multiple reports since at least 2005. Those reports carry numbers, dates, and named program offices. Anyone can pull them. Take them in order. A 2007 report on defense acquisitions assessed the technology readiness and program management of several directed energy weapons efforts across the services. A 2013 report on the Defense Department's science and technology portfolio included directed energy among the areas assessed. A 2020 report on the Missile Defense Agency's investments covered directed energy work aimed at intercepting missiles in their boost phase. 3 reports, 13 years apart, one subject. What did the auditors find? Broadly, the usual thing. Promising laboratory results are hard to turn into reliable fielded systems. That is the finding the GAO has recorded in very nearly every major defense technology program it has ever examined. It is not a scandal and it is not a confession. It is an auditor reporting in the flattest prose available that hard engineering is hard. That flatness is itself informative. The Congressional Research Service keeps a public report on the Defense Department's directed energy programs, updated at intervals through the 2010s and 2020s, an unclassified overview of the major laser and microwave efforts, their funding, and their status. And here is the argument that Trail supports. A wholly invented conspiracy does not generate a congressional mandate, a joint office, 3 dated audit reports, and a research service updating its file for years. Then the hard part. These documents cannot confirm the claims that concern targeted individuals, and they cannot refute them either. They audit budgets against congressional direction. They do not interview targets or examine covert operations. The absence of a GAO report on individual targeting is not evidence that it happens, and not evidence that it does not. It is simply outside what this oversight was built to see. That limit is where we go next. Why come back to the oversight record now so late in this chapter? Because it does evidentiary work that is easy to undervalue, and because it supports the single most useful distinction this series has to offer. Institutional infrastructure is documented. Institutional intent is not. Hold those two apart and almost everything else becomes easier to think about clearly. Collapse them together, and you lose the argument before you have finished making it. Consider what a completely fabricated conspiracy cannot produce. It cannot produce a congressional master plan dated March 2000. A joint office stood up that June, 3 separate Government Accountability Office reports, and a Congressional Research Service paper still being revised years later. Paper trails are physical objects. Real people in real government employment write them, file them in real document systems, and anybody who knows how to search can pull them back out again. Here is the trail in order, and every entry on it carries a date. A Congressional Master Plan in March 2000. A Joint Technology Office standing up 3 months later. Accountability Office reviews in 2007, 2013, and 2020. A Congressional Research Service overview revised at intervals ever since. Nobody fakes a sequence like that, and nobody fakes it for institutions that no one is actually funding. So the trail establishes something real, and it is worth being exact about what. It establishes that the offices exist, that the budgets were appropriated, that the programs were reviewed. That is confirmation of infrastructure, and it is genuinely strong. It is not confirmation of intent, and it never was. The documents prove the buildings are there. They say nothing whatever about what anyone inside them might have chosen to do. The limit is worth stating plainly, because it is structural rather than accidental. Congressional auditors are built to ask one question. Is this program spending its money the way Congress directed? They are not built to ask whether a program is also doing something else entirely off the books that Congress never directed. Different question, different mandate, different access. The first is answerable from public records. The second, by design, is not. Say it another way. The Accountability Office and the Research Service are auditors of the public budget record. They are not investigators of human rights abuses. They review programs, budgets, and technical progress against congressional direction. They do not interview targets, they do not take individual complaints, and they do not examine classified evidence of covert operations. Those tasks belong to other bodies entirely, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest about the record. The knowledge base preserves an older instance of exactly this problem. Reviewing the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee report on Gulf War illness, it notes that the recommendations for independent oversight and central record-keeping remain relevant today, particularly for emerging technologies such as directed energy weapons. That finding dates from the 1990s, and it is still being cited. The lesson carries. When nobody is mandated to keep the record does not get kept. So what follows from the fact that no Accountability Office report mentions the targeting of civilians? Nothing at all in either direction. It is not evidence that such targeting happens, and it is not evidence that it does not. It tells you only that the question sits outside the mandate. A different kind of oversight, inspectors general, intelligence committees, watchdogs cleared for classified material might reach it. Public audit reports cannot. That is the honest position on the evidence, and it leaves an obvious practical question. If the map is this solid and the claim is still this open, what should a target or an advocate actually do with it? The chapter answers with one word, and the word is precision. Everything that follows in this section is a rule for keeping a claim inside the part of the record that can survive a hostile reading. The rules are unglamorous and they work. Cite the office, not the military. Cite the budget line, not their funding. Cite the report number and the date, not a government report said. Name the limit out loud, so a reader knows where your documentation stops and your inference begins. For small habits, and together they decide whether a serious reader engages with your argument or reaches for the nearest excuse to dismiss it. Compare the two versions of the same claim. One says the military-industrial complex is doing this to me. The other names the Directed Energy Directorate, a fiscal year budget justification, and an accountability office report number. The second claim can be checked. A skeptical reader can look it up and may still disagree with your conclusion, but they have to engage with it. The first claim cannot be checked at all, so it gets discarded. Picture the argument as 3 stacked layers, and keep them from bleeding into one another. The bottom layer is documented. Named institutions, appropriated budgets, dated oversight reports. The middle layer is inference, the reasoning that an ecosystem this large could sustain something hidden. The top layer is contested, that any of it has been aimed at a specific, unconsenting civilian. Each layer needs its own evidence, and the bottom cannot carry the top. There is a related trap, and it catches careful people too. Capability exists in this sector, and this sector is attacking civilians, are separated by an enormous distance. Never let the first sentence do the work of the second. And the same discipline applies to people. Presenting a paper at a symposium is not evidence of wrongdoing. This series names organizations from the public record. It does not name their members, officers, or employees as perpetrators. The next rule is simply to keep watching the same channels this chapter drew on. Auditors and researchers do not stop publishing when a chapter goes to press. New reports appear on directed energy programs, on non-lethal weapons concepts, on human subjects protections in defense-funded research, and on the movement of personnel between the department and its contractors. Each one is a chance to refresh the map. Sustained institutional watching is tedious, and it is how accountability works. That last item, the revolving door between the department and its contractors, is ordinary, well-documented journalism about institutions and incentives. It is not a personal accusation, and it should never be written as one. The knowledge base article on regulatory capture keeps the boundary explicit, noting that although industry influence over radiation safety standards is documented, no evidence connects it to intentional targeting of individuals. That is precisely where the record stops. With the discipline stated, we can finally lay the whole thing out. 6 sections have put pieces on the table, and it is worth assembling them in one view before this episode moves on. 3 pieces, 8 named organizations, 6 states, and the District of Columbia. Every node independently checkable against the institution's own public materials. This is the map, and the point of a map is that other people can walk it themselves. Piece A is the society and the office. The professional society gives the field a public face, a journal and a conference, the visible seam where a mostly classified discipline touches open academic life. The Joint Technology Office, born of that March 2000 master plan, pools the Air Force, Army, and Navy laser research money into one purse, and coordinates the internship pipeline that names 7 institutions outright, each findable in an afternoon. The knowledge base preserves an outsider's description of the society, drawn from the human rights literature. Its author notes that research on directed energy had grown large enough to support a professional society of private contractors and Defense Department officials holding security clearances, running symposiums since the spring of 2001, with a meeting planned for March 2007. That is the seam described from outside, accurately, and with no accusation attached. Piece B is the laboratories. The Air Force Research Laboratories Directed Energy Directorate runs Kirtland and Maui on a 9-figure budget. doing the core laser physics. The Army's laboratory at Adelphi and the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington add their service-specific work, each with a history stretching back decades before this debate existed. Piece C is the wider network, a human performance wing, a postgraduate school, a missile defense command, an institute of technology. 8 organizations, 6 states, and the District of Columbia, and notice what none of it requires. Not one of these 3 pieces needs a single unverified claim about a single named victim to be true. The map stands entirely on its own, which is exactly why it is worth taking seriously as a foundation. What gets built on top of it is a separate question. Next, where this map connects to the rest of the series. So the map stands on its own. 8 organizations, 6 states, and the District of Columbia, every node checkable against the institution's own public materials. But this chapter was never meant to stand alone. It sits inside a 50-part arc, and it connects to the parts around it in specific traceable ways. Before we ask what the map changes, let us trace those connections because they tell you what this chapter is for. Part 11 of this series examined Echelon, the global signals intelligence architecture confirmed by the European Parliament's Temporary Committee in 2001. That report, catalogued A50264, is a documented public record. The mined weapon document treats surveillance of that kind as phase 1 of a 2-phase assault. That framing is the source documents, not a finding. Part 11 covers what flows through the network. This chapter maps the institutions that do the underlying physics. Hold that structure at arm's length. The 2-phase model, surveillance first and directed energy second, is the architecture of one contested document, not a conclusion drawn from evidence. What is documented is that both halves have real institutional counterparts. A signals intelligence system a European Parliamentary Committee investigated, and a directed energy research sector with a society, a journal, and a joint funding office. The counterparts are real. The claim that they operate as one assault protocol is not established. Part 12 catalogued the directed energy taxonomy itself. Extremely low frequency fields at one end, microwave in the middle, laser at the other. That part maps effects, what such energy can do to matter and to tissue. This chapter maps the institutions whose research makes those effects thinkable. The division is deliberate. Weapons categories and the offices that fund them are separate evidentiary questions, and mixing them is how careful arguments come apart. Part 19, the chapter immediately after this one, takes up the phrase psychotronic weapon and its brief, strange career in the United States legislative record. In 2001, House Bill 2977, the Space Preservation Act, listed psychotronic weapons alongside lasers, microwaves, and other exotic devices in a definitions clause. 3 months later, that clause was withdrawn, and the bill was reintroduced without any mention of the term at all. Laid out in order, the cross-referenced record has a shape. 1974. A Senate subcommittee examines the federal role in behavior modification. March 2000. Congress orders a laser master plan, and a joint office follows in June. 2001. The European Parliament reports on Echelon, and a definitions clause names psychotronic weapons. 2008. The Human Performance Wing is activated. Separate threads, decades apart, running through the same small set of institutions. When a member of Congress names a category of weapon in a bill, the useful question is not only what the bill says. It is whether any real institution is actually building anything that fits the category. A word in a withdrawn clause proves very little. The same word, set against a funded research sector with laboratories and budgets, is worth examining carefully. The map assembled here is part of that answer. Parts 22 through 25, later in this series, take up the history of federal behavior modification programs. They run from the 1974 Senate Subcommittee on Individual Rights through the disclosed history of MKUltra to the 21st century neuroscience programs that some in the targeted individual community regard as their modern descendants. That last step is the contested one. A shared research field is not a proven lineage, and this series will say so plainly when it gets there. Two of the nodes on this map do double duty in that longer story. The Human Performance Wing at Wright-Patterson, activated in 2008, and the DARPA program ladder in biological technologies both sit between the 1974 era and the neurotechnology of today. That is an institutional bridge, and it is documented. Whether anything crossed it toward an unconsenting civilian is exactly the question the public record does not answer. One warning about cross-references, because they are easy to misuse. Listing 5 chapters that touch a subject does not make the subject proven. Each part in this series has to carry its own evidence. A citation web can look like corroboration when it is really just repetition, the same claim bouncing between chapters until it sounds settled. So treat these connections as a table of contents for the argument, not as a substitute for the argument itself. So much for where the map connects. The harder question is what it changes. A reader who has followed 8 sections of addresses, budget lines, and oversight reports is entitled to ask what all that precision is actually for. The answer is different depending on who you are. A target, a researcher, an advocate, or simply someone trying to work out how much of this to believe. Let us take those in turn. For a target, the map does one concrete thing. It converts a vague and unfalsifiable fear, the military-industrial complex is after me, into something far more useful. A list of specific offices, each with an address, a budget, and a public record. You can cite them precisely instead of gesturing at them vaguely. Nothing about that list proves anyone's experience. It does change what a person can put in front of a skeptical reader. That precision draws a boundary worth respecting on its own terms. Naming the machine is not the same act as naming a perpetrator, and this series tries hard never to blur the two. An institution can be described from its own published materials. A person cannot be accused on the same basis. Attending a symposium, publishing a paper, or holding a clearance is employment, not evidence. Every name in this chapter has been an organization, never an individual. For the researcher and the advocate, the map is a method rather than a conclusion. Rule 1. Verify every node in a claimed network against that institution's own public materials before repeating the claim. Not against another advocate's summary. Not against a forum post. Against the fact sheet, the budget justification, the charter. A surprising amount of what circulates in this field does not survive that first step, and what does survive is worth far more afterwards. Rule 2. Track the oversight paper trail. Government Accountability Office and Congressional Research Service reports are free, public, and dated, and they are where a real institutional history actually lives. A report number and a year beat any amount of confident assertion. Rule 3, and the hardest. Label what remains inferred, in the same breath every time. Those 3 steps are the whole method, and they are not complicated. They are only tedious. Which brings us to the discipline this whole chapter has been built around. Hold the inferential gap open on purpose. Real, documented infrastructure on one side, a contested and proven claim about its specific application on the other. Both are true statements about the world at the same time. The temptation is to close the distance between them, because an open gap is uncomfortable to live with. Resisting that temptation is the entire discipline. And collapsing that gap costs the same either way. Declare the claim proven because the infrastructure exists, and you have made a logical error a hostile reader will find in seconds. Declare the infrastructure irrelevant because the claim is unproven, and you have thrown away the one part of the picture that is genuinely checkable. Certainty and dismissal fail identically. The map is valuable precisely because it is solid enough to stand on, whatever gets built above it. The same discipline applies to a target's own records. The knowledge base describes the 1000-event memory log, a documentation practice widely used in this community, and notes plainly that such logs have no recognized evidentiary value in court, and that critics see a real risk of confirmation bias. The one-voice declaration guide is equally blunt about its own limits. It does not start an investigation, and it does not guarantee that anyone will believe you. For this series as a whole, then, the map is a foundation rather than a finding. Having established that the institutions are real, the chapters that follow can ask harder questions. What has this research actually produced, and how honestly do the claims made about it hold up against the public record? Part 19 does exactly that with the word psychotronic. Parts 22 through 25 do it with the behavior modification history, decade by decade. The building is mapped. What happens inside it is the subject of everything that follows. That is not a cliffhanger. It is an accurate description of where the evidence stops. In the closing section of this episode, we will hold the two columns side by side one last time, what is documented and what is inferred, and be precise about which of them each piece of this chapter actually belongs to before we close. We have named the buildings, the budgets, and the meetings. Now we close this chapter honestly. The epilogue asks you to carry 3 things away from Part 18, and only 3. Not a verdict, not a confession. 3 durable statements that survive scrutiny, and 1 open question that this chapter deliberately refuses to close on your behalf. Take them slowly. Each one is doing different work, and the difference between them matters enormously. Here they are in order. 1. The machine is real and you can verify it yourself. 2. The oversight trail is real too, and it confirms the institutions without confirming any claim about a person. 3. The leap from documented infrastructure to proven civilian targeting stays open. Nothing in this closing block will tidy that away. Holding it open is not evasion. On a subject this consequential, it is the only honest place to stand. Start with the first. 7 institutions, spanning 3 service branches and 6 states plus the District of Columbia. Each has a public budget, a public address, and in most cases a congressional oversight history reaching back to at least the year 2000. The Directed Energy Professional Society exists. The High Energy Laser Joint Technology Office exists. The Air Force Research Laboratories Directed Energy Directorate exists. None of that is rumor. It is a set of checkable facts. The dates are specific, which is what makes them checkable. In March 2000, a congressional mandate created the High Energy Laser Joint Technology Office. It stood up 3 months later. The High Energy Laser Executive Review Panel issued its master plan on the 24th of March that year. Closed symposia began in the spring of 2001. The 711th Human Performance Wing was activated in March 2008. One number anchors the scale. The Air Force Research Laboratories Directed Energy Directorate reports a budget north of $300 million a year. That is a single directorate in a single service branch in a single state. Add the Army and Navy laboratories, the Naval Postgraduate School, the Space and Missile Defense Command, and the Maui Optical and Supercomputing Site, and the ecosystem is substantial by any measure. Substantial, though, is not the same as aimed. The Directed Energy Professional Society is the connective tissue. The knowledge base records it as a body drawn from private contractors and Department of Defense officials holding security clearances, running symposia since the spring of 2001. Corporate members named in the record include Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon. Attendance at several of its conferences is restricted to government employees and contractors. That is documented. It is also on its own ordinary institutional life. Its own charter states the purpose plainly: the interchange of ideas and information among professionals in the directed energy community, and the promotion of education and training in directed energy technologies. Read that coldly. It is what any professional society says about itself. Engineers meet, publish, teach, and lobby for research money. That is how technical fields work. The society existing and holding conferences is not by itself evidence of a covert program against anyone. Now the second thing to carry forward. The oversight trail is real, and it matters more than people expect. The Government Accountability Office and the Congressional Research Service have both reviewed parts of this program publicly since at least 2005, in reports that are dated, numbered, and citable. That is independent confirmation that these institutions are not invented. Anyone can pull the reports. Very little in this field is that easy to check. But be precise about what an audit is for. The Government Accountability Office examines cost, schedule, and program management. The Congressional Research Service summarizes policy for legislators. Neither body is structured to confirm or deny whether a specific technology was ever used against a named private citizen, and neither has done so. Their silence on that question is not a denial, and it is not a confirmation. It is simply outside their remit. Hold that sentence. The oversight trail proves the buildings are real. It does not prove what happens inside them. Both halves are load-bearing. Drop the first and you are dismissing a documented ecosystem. Drop the second and you are treating an audit of laser procurement as though it settled a question it never asked. This series keeps both halves, every time, even when that is less satisfying than a clean answer. Hold the two columns apart. On the documented side, public addresses and fact sheets, a directorate budget above $300 million, audits since 2005, and organizational histories that match point for point what each institution says about itself. On the inferred side, honestly labeled, no public record surveyed for this chapter ties any of these 7 institutions to a named private individual. Collapsing those columns is the failure this chapter was built to avoid. 3 more things sit on that inferred side, and each deserves saying out loud. Whether any fielded directed energy device can reach a specific unconsenting person at range, covertly, remains unresolved by open science. A stated research trajectory toward enhanced human performance is not evidence that anyone walked it to a civilian target. And bioeffects research aimed at protecting soldiers is not evidence of bioeffects research aimed at harming civilians. Each gap is real. Naming it protects the rest. Both columns are true at once, and neither erases the other. That is uncomfortable, and it is the point. The temptation, once you have assembled a map this solid, is to let its solidity carry a much larger claim. That because the machine exists, it must be pointed at you. This section of the chapter exists to resist that, on behalf of the credibility of everything the series is trying to build. Here is the honest inventory of what we still do not know. We do not know whether any of this infrastructure has ever been directed at a private citizen. We do not know what sits inside the classified fraction of these programs, and absence of published capability is not evidence of a hidden one. We do not know what the 7/11th Human Performance Wing's bioeffects work has produced beyond its stated protective mission. Here the evidence runs out. What can you do with a chapter that refuses to conclude? Use it as a checklist. Every institution here has a public name, a public address, and a public fact sheet. Type one into a search engine and read what comes back. Pull the Accountability Office reports by number. Then keep your own documentation separate from your inferences, dated and specific. That discipline is what turns testimony into something an investigator can actually work with. The chapter lands on one line, and we will let it stand. Naming the machine is necessary. It is not sufficient. What the machine is aimed at is the question this chapter maps but does not answer. If that feels like an unfinished ending, sit with the discomfort. A field that has been damaged by overclaiming is rebuilt slowly, by people willing to say precisely where their knowledge stops, and to go no further. Everything in this chapter is sourced, and the list is short enough to work through in an evening. The institutional record comes from the One Voice knowledge base, Entry 19, Sections 2 and 5. The Society's own website supplied its charter. The Accountability Office and Research Service reports carry dates and numbers. Cross-references point forward to House Resolution 2977 and back to the European Parliament's Echelon report. Check them. That is the whole point. If this chapter left you wanting somewhere to put your own evidence, that is what TI One Voice is for. Create a free account at one.witisk.org. Keep a dated, structured record, and add your voice to the collective declaration. Every episode of the series streams on TITV at meet.witisk.org under Public, TITV. It is free, it is yours, and you are not doing this alone. Next time, we stop mapping buildings and go after a single word. Part 19. The Psychotronic Weapon, Definition, History, and Legal Status. It is a strange term with a genuinely narrow legal history. In 2001, a bill before the United States Congress named psychotronic weapons in its text, and then that language disappeared. We will follow the word through statute books, treaties, and translation, and see exactly what it does and does not mean. Thank you for staying with a chapter that gives you a map instead of a verdict. That takes patience, and patience is in short supply on this subject. We named the machine accurately, we marked the place where the evidence stops, and we did not pretend the gap was smaller than it is. Carry those three things forward. We will see you next time on Knowledge Targeting. Take care of yourself.